Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
We welcome you, those of you who are part of our in-person gathering, and our hundreds of friends who are part of our virtual community. We say good evening and we welcome you. My name is Reverend Dr. Greg Groover, and I'm a trustee here at the Massachusetts Historical Society. And I'm also pastor of the historic Charles Street African Methodist Episcopal Church in Roxbury, a 208-year-old congregation previously located on Beacon Hill. I'm delighted to welcome you tonight to Whose Independence? Black Experiences During the American Revolution. I've been looking forward to this conversation from a personal level for two reasons. First, to learn more about the experiences of my people during the revolution, the American Revolution, and then second, for all of us to appreciate the importance of sharing the history, the stories, and the life experiences of all communities of people that shape our understanding of the world we live in today. Over the next few months, the Massachusetts Historical Society will host a variety of programs focusing on different aspects of the American Revolution. But tonight, with excitement, we will uncover the stories of Black individuals who enlisted in the Continental and British armies, who wrote petitions against slavery, and who established valuable community institutions, including spaces for religious services and education. I'm very honored to now welcome our tonight's panelists. And we're very, very pleased to have, second to my left, Dr. Noelle Trent. Boston is very honored to have her and the leadership role that she plays on Beacon Hill. She's the president and the CEO of the Museum of African American History, both in Boston and Nantucket. Dr. Trent is a respected public historian, and she is a national museum leader. And she uses her expertise to amplify stories of Black history and culture. In 2025, the Boston Magazine named her as one of the 150 most influential Bostonians. Let's hear it first. To her left and to your right is Dr. Benjamin Remelot. He's a visiting assistant professor in the Department of History and Classics at Providence College. His forthcoming book project will explore the lives of patriots of color who lived in the Northeast both during and after the American Revolution. We're so excited to have you tonight, Doctor. Going a little out Midwest, we have with us Dr. Cherno Cisse, who is the Associate Professor in the Religious Studies Department of DePaul University in Chicago. He's a historian of the Black Atlantic and the early American Republic. And he's currently completing a book, a manuscript, I should say, on Black Boston and the African American Freemasonry. We are so looking forward to reading that project. And let's welcome him. And finally, last but not least, our moderator, Dr. Kiera Singleton. She is the executive director of the Royal House and Slave Quarters. She's also a postdoctoral fellow for the Slavery, Colonialism, and Their Legacies Project at Tufts University outside of Boston. Between 2021 and 2023, Dr. Singleton was an American Democracy Fellow in the Charles Warren Center at Harvard University. Welcome, Dr. Singleton. And so, without further delay, I invite you to sit back as our esteemed speakers discuss how Black individuals fought for independence, how they shaped American democracy, and established communities amidst the turbulence and the unpredictability of war. Please join me once again in welcoming Dr. Singleton to begin this conversation.
Thank you so much for those wonderful introductions. And thank you to everyone who put on this program. I'm really honored to be here to speak with this esteemed panelist. So I'm going to start off with a little bit of a fun question, a question that's been on my mind a lot as we are in the midst of the commemorations around the 250th. And that question is, when we think about the word revolutionary, does the American Revolution count? Was it actually revolutionary for Black people?
All right, I'll break the ice. I'll break the ice. I'm gonna say no. If you talk to scholars who are not from America, they don't call it the American Revolution. They call it the American War for Independence. Two very different things. When I think of a revolution, I think of the Haitian Revolution that literally turned this society on its head, or the French Revolution, where people actually lost their heads. Something that turns, some of you just got that. Appreciate it. I'm here all night. I think of revolutions as something that is radical, that forces society to change, that flips things upside down. When we look at the American Revolution or the War for Independence, what we see is pretty much the same power structures remain in place. We get rid of the British loyalists, but you still have the upper class still in place. No one has really pushed them out. They just kind of take over that other land, those other businesses. So I would say no, I don't think it's revolutionary. In the nature of the war that it was, I do think it was impactful globally in that it influences the construction of other democracies for the next 200 plus years. But I don't know if we could call the war that happens here revolutionary because it didn't flip society on its head, and we don't see a significant change in the status of people of African descent in this country.
So if you're going to take the macro perspective, the international perspective, I think I want to look at maybe the micro perspective, because I think, individual people, individual communities and states, they're going to be looking at the revolution and feeling the impacts of the revolution on maybe a spectrum, right? After the revolution, there are still many, many people enslaved. There are thousands of people who do win their freedom as a result of the War for Independence, including by serving in the Revolutionary War or serving the revolution and then buying the freedom of family members. But it's definitely not as impactful as it could be. If you look at the census information, the numbers, the number of enslaved people in the Northeast in 1775. Well, the North. So the Northeast, so New England, New York, New Jersey, Delaware, Pennsylvania. In 1775, there's 55,000 enslaved people, roughly. 15 years later, 1790s, well after the War for Independence, there's still 48,000 enslaved people. 40 years later, in 1830, there's still at least 44 people that we know of who were enslaved around New England, in Connecticut, and Rhode Island, and New Hampshire. And that doesn't even count all the children of people of color who were forcibly indentured throughout that period. Those numbers are going to continue on throughout the period. But we will see some gradual changes, and I think especially for the 60, big proportion, a large number of the 6,600 patriots of color who fought in the war, a lot of them are getting their freedom. They are being emancipated because of this opportunity that they might not otherwise have had.
So I want to thank the MHS and everybody who's here, and it's wonderful to see some familiar faces, and very thankful to the panelists, and thankful for this question. It's a fantastic question. This question of revolution, and we have this perspective, this kind of macro perspective, and we have this micro perspective. From the macro perspective, after these 13 colonies successfully revolt from Great Britain, we still have a whole history of westward expansion, right? So you could talk about the continuation of imperialism, and that would be, I mean, that's true. You have the leaving out, the ignoring, the dismissal, the extermination of indigenous populations. And I'm going to do a thing here. There's an interesting kind of relationship in our conversation between the present and the past. And so we can talk about the past from a macro perspective, in which case, to some degree, we're relying upon hindsight. Kind of, we know what has happened at this point in time. And then to kind of think about today, but then think about today relative to the thoughts, dreams, hopes, desires of those who lived through this on the macro level, well, then it seems to me that that raises all sorts of other questions about this issue of revolution. And so, to be clear, right, extension of imperialism, neo-colonialism. But at the same time, there were people who made decisions on the ground about what they were going to do, that recognized that this particular moment, the late 1700s, that something was happening that hadn't necessarily happened before. Something was happening that gave new context to the acts of resistance that they had been doing for generations. And so they were very quick to take advantage of new things that happened. And so there, I think when we think about this micro perspective, and we think about it in the context of today's activism, even if we argue that the revolution was not revolutionary, I do think there are many different participants, men, women, children, who saw this as a particular moment to do something, so that perhaps the next day even, or the next generation could be different.
All right. Well, we're really getting into it. So I want to kind of keep going with that line of thought, because one of the things that I struggle with when we're talking about the American Revolution and the role that Black people play in it is that some historians, and now this has changed a lot with the work of Jared Hardesty and Gloria Whiting, have said, oh, Black people were just so inspired by the white colonists that they too decided to seize their freedom. And so I'm wondering if you can talk about the long and rich history of Black people beginning at the beginning of the 18th century, and talk to us about how they influence actually some of the colonists' claims for freedom.
I think she was talking to you.
I'm talking to all of you. I'm talking to all.
She was talking to you.
Well, certainly we can talk about the historiography. What historians have written about the American Revolution is dense and long and complicated and nuanced. And one aspect of talking about the revolution is talking about its relationship to abolition. Abolition not just in America, but in the Americas, or broader, perhaps global ideas about changing understandings of freedom. And so it's certainly the case that there are scholars who talked about abolition as related to a set of ideas, that new understandings of what it meant to be a human reframed how people understood their relationships to each other. And that's great. And the work that you mentioned, Kira, part of its brilliance is that it, in some ways, it's moving from or it's borrowing from the social history of kind of the 80s and the 90s, but it's not social history for social history's sake. In other words, it's making the argument that if we look at something like the family, Black people, and the arguments about how to talk about family kind of aside for the moment, but Black people in many ways wanted to keep their families together. Now we can have a conversation about how you define family, but if we leave that aside, the act of wanting to keep a family together is always an act of resistance in the context of enslavement. And so then one of the things that happens over time is, given changing historical contexts, even the idea of family becomes a very potent metaphorical tool on the part of the enslaved to argue for freedom.
I think I like your question because for me, this is one of my pet peeves, right? Is that especially within museums in the public history field, it has become very common, and I won't doubt the well-meaning intentions of saying, well, Black people got their idea of freedom or liberty or democracy by learning about John Hancock and John Adams, and nothing against them. Appreciate what they did. Hancock has a great signature. It's on a big piece of paper. You probably heard of it. But I think it takes away the intellectual capacity of the Black community and the enslaved community. So like Cherno was saying about keeping your family together as an act of resistance, I don't need someone to tell me that I don't want to be separated from my parents and my siblings. That's inherent for my humanity, right? I really don't know if I need to be told that I'm oppressed. That is reminded to me when I want to do something that I see a free person doing and I'm restricted. What I think is unique about Boston is that there's an urban enslaved experience here, but we are also an international port, right? And so you're on a wharf and people are going out and coming back in. People are working on the wharves. Enslaved people are working on the wharves. There are conversations that are happening in pubs, in barber shops, and things like that. Inevitably, people are talking about what they're seeing around the world. And remember, people are going out 2 or 3 years at a time. Nobody's got a phone, so people are coming back with stories, and they're crafting an idea based off of the stories that they've heard, things that they've seen about what this country should be. And although we don't have the documentation, I think simply by asking the question, how did they see themselves? Right? We don't necessarily have the diaries, but the regular enslaved people had a concept for themselves. We are now shifting the ability and the intelligence of that community. And I think every time we say that they simply got it from Hancock or Adams, or God forbid Jefferson, because that's complicated. Some of you got that. Some of you need to read notes on Virginia. It's a thing. I think they understood. And I think we have to give them credit, or at least begin to position our own minds of what if they thought about themselves in this way.
So building on, well, first off, I forgot to say thank you to the MHS for having us here and for throwing this fantastic event on. Thank you. I always forget to do that. But building on both of these points, and maybe connecting it to Black soldiers and their motivations for enlisting. I mean, there's going to be a lot of different reasons why people are going to sign on to the patriot cause, why they're going to put their bodies on the line for the patriot cause, right? And going back to Benjamin Quarles, one of his main arguments, looking at what are the motivations for the enslaved to align either with the loyalists or the patriots, and really like one of the big motivating factors is what side is most likely to give you your freedom and to give you freedom for your family. When it comes to, especially in the North, because there's a larger population of free Black people. I mean, there are this combination of different factors, right? For the enslaved, there's this motivation that you can get more easily with the Patriot cause. You can get your freedom through them. There are some already freed Black men who are patriotic. They have these patriotic sentiments. Like James Fortin is a teenager in Pennsylvania, and he's begging his mother to go let him enlist with the Patriot cause because he wants to stick it to the British. And his mother's very terrified about him doing this. And then what immediately happens, he gets taken as a prisoner of war. Eventually gets home. But, you have these desires for freedom and emancipation, these desires for patriotism, also connecting to family, the economic concerns. John Resch he had a book in the late 90s called Suffering Soldiers, and he looked at about 1,000 pension applications by predominantly white veterans. And some of the statistical evidence he came up with was that at this sample size of about 840 predominantly white men, 26% of them were married by the end of the war. From my work, which I want to plug, the book, which will eventually come out, based on the dissertation, Friends, Brothers, and Citizens, the revolutionary patriots of color who made America, or something along those lines. I looked at something similar and looked at those pension applications and looked at how many Black and Indigenous men were also married. What were their concerns along the home front? And what I found was John Resch found, 26% of his sample size were married. My sample size of about 80. No, so he had a sample size of about 240. I had a sample size of about 80. Of my Black and Indigenous veterans, roughly double that. So 50% were married by the end of the war. So if half of the patriots of color who are enlisting with the Patriot cause have these concerns along the home front, if they are married, if they have children, that's an extra incentive for them to enlist. Maybe they were patriotic, maybe they weren't, maybe they were enslaved before, maybe they weren't. But those very real personal motivations are also going to be driving people towards fighting for the revolution.
So I come from a Black studies background, and one of the analytics that I love to think through is also failure. I think that there's a lot that we can learn through failure. And I'm curious, since we started to talk about individual experiences, what families were experiencing, how people were being separated. How does this period, this Black revolutionary period in Massachusetts, but we can also go beyond in other places in the North, kind of reveal the day-to-day life of Black people? What are they experiencing in Beacon Hill? What are they negotiating? What are they writing? What are they thinking? How can we expand upon that to also think through this important moment, but also the ways in which it fails Black people?
So in some ways, to take up this great question and use patriotism as a kind of segue, if we and I think Ben, you started to open up this idea of patriotism itself. That I think there's a general public that hears the word patriotism and automatically assumes that you have this individual who has been kind of readily shaped by the revolution and clearly understands this thing that we call American nationalism, and then they just kind of run with it. But I think that the idea of patriotism is something that gets developed over time. And as it gets developed over time, failures and successes, I think, are also calibrated over time. In other words, when we look at some of the, kind of more famous instances of petitioning, either kind of just before the revolution or just after, and thinking about reparations, my sense is that at least in Massachusetts, Black people see opportunity. And even as though they're consistently met with particular failures. So, for example, if you look at the petitioners who begin in 1773, they in many ways don't get a kind of formal ending of slavery because of their petitioning by, let's say, 1777. Certainly, slavery erodes in Massachusetts, but erodes for a whole variety of reasons. So in that context, I think during the revolutionary moment in the North, Black people are 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 anticipating failure actually, and one example would be when you look at the petitions, they're talking about Black people in terms of principle as equals, but they're also recognizing that enslavers see Black people as property, and so the early petitions are trying to negotiate that from the very beginning. Even though we're focused on the North, if you look at a state like Virginia and the way in which the expansion of evangelical Protestantism happens there, it happens because Black people are joining Protestant evangelical churches in the South. And so in that context, even in one where slavery ultimately expands, even there, you have Black people that are constantly negotiating the boundaries of their freedom. So it's less about kind of failure versus success, and it's more about how can we get perhaps a little bit more success? How can we change the discourse about how we're defined using principles from the Enlightenment? Using religious discourse, but then also leveraging the everyday intimacies that happen within a family or within an enslaved household or within a church.
And I think this is where it's helpful to think about things along like a sliding scale or along a spectrum again, because when it comes to Black soldiers, I mean, there are some who are enslaved during the war and they fight for the patriot cause and they get out of the war and they're still enslaved, or their former enslavers come after them and re-enslave them. There are those, there's a veteran I look at by the name of Caesar Updike, who after the war, he's got a house for himself, it burns down, and he spends the rest of his days working on the homestead of his former enslaver. And then for a lot of people, though, there's this mass migration movement to big cities, to urban ports, especially to Providence and to Boston, where, I mean, this is really the story of the late 1780s and 90s and going into the early 1800s. But I mean, the creation of mutual aid societies, schools, there's a lot of uplift and this upside to the story, but it's going to take a while. Right? It's not happening all at once, and that community has to be built. And sometimes it's a hard fought win. Especially when men of color, including veterans of color, are getting warned out or pushed out of cities like Providence in the aftermath of the Revolution, given that surge of especially formerly enslaved people to these urban ports where there's more economic and social opportunities for them than before. And maybe this gets in the question again of failed revolution versus successful revolution and what it means to different people at different times.
Well, I'm glad that you went from the 1770s through to the early 1800s, because that takes us up to the period of significance for my institution, the Museum of African American History. Here in Boston, we steward the African Meeting House of Boston, which is built in 1806, and it is the country's oldest existing Black church building. And so to build off of Ben's point, community formation takes time, right? In Massachusetts, people like to brag that by 1790, there were no enslaved people here. And yes, it took several legal cases to make that happen, but what was life like for people? And if we look at some of the accounts, what we're finding is life is a little difficult for folks. I mean, there's still racism in Boston. Let's call a thing a thing. There is still this sort of oppression that people are experiencing, and there's a need to create community. And so people are coalescing in certain areas of the city. But it's still at issue for folks. And so by the time we get to 1805, in December of 1805, there's a group in the basement of Faneuil Hall that forms what becomes known as the First African Free Baptist Church. They would go on to build the African Meeting House and stay on Beacon Hill for almost 90 years. And from that, there would be birthed other churches, other Black churches here in Boston. But that northern slope of Beacon Hill, once that meeting house is built, becomes this anchor for the community. People are no longer willing to be relegated to the balconies of Old North Church and King's Chapel. They want community. We're finding accounts of people driving their wagons in from Lexington, and Lexington in traffic today to Boston is a lot. There's no highway? That's dedication. You really need some community, right? And so I think I say that to say that that's how much motivation, that's how much drive, that's how much need there was for community and coming together. It takes time though, and part of it is getting a critical mass. Part of it is negotiating some very difficult realities. But I think here in Massachusetts, we do a disservice when we just say, well, 1790, there was no more enslavement, so things were okay. And they're not okay because in Frederick Douglass's autobiographies, he talks about how unwelcoming Boston was, except for the Black spaces. And that if he could get to Boston, if he could get to 12th Baptist, if he could get to the African Meeting House, if he could get to Charles Street, there are certain places he knows that if he can get to, he can find welcoming. That says a lot about the dynamics of the city that took generations to shift.
And adding on to that, so in addition to Massachusetts, I mean, Vermont, right? Saying that there's no enslaved people in Vermont during and after the Revolution, and you have veterans of the Revolution, veterans of color from the Revolution who moved to Vermont, and they seize that message, this sign of hope that Vermont is going to be this welcoming space to free Black people. But there's instances like in the case of Jeffrey Brace, who's got an autobiography. I love sharing it with students. It's a really great text where he's stolen from Africa as a child. He fights for the British in the 7 Years' War. He fights for the Americans, for the Patriots in the Revolution. He wins his freedom as a result of that service in the Revolution. He moves to Vermont. He marries a woman in Vermont, and he struggles with the fact that he has no say when some white folks in Manchester, Vermont, come along and take away his stepchildren, indenture them against his will. And then years later, in Putney, Vermont, similar thing happens. He's got some neighbors who are upset at him, and they try taking his kids away. And this time, he's putting up even more of a fight. And it seems like they don't get taken away from him, his children, in that case. But the racism still exists. Right.
So, no. Do you want to say something really quick? Well, I want us to think about what happens when we place Black women at the center of the revolution. How does that change the conversation that we're having? How does it change the political, intellectual, and social dimensions that we've been speaking about earlier? And what does it allow us to see differently about society, but also about claims to freedom?
Well, first of all, when you just talk about women in general, you're widening the scope of history. And so everybody, when it comes to the revolution, who does everybody talk about? Abigail Adams. Nothing against her, love her dearly. But if one more person tells me, remember the ladies, I'm like, hey, listen, she said more than that, first of all. I personally love the letter that she sends to her husband when he makes a remark about how Thomas Jefferson's wife can come to Philadelphia. And her reply to him is, I bet she can. She's got hundreds of slaves to keep things going. I'm here with your kids. You get 100 slaves, I could come visit you in Philadelphia, is in essence what she said, right? Like, you get me some help and I can come visit. Have you lost your mind? By the way, I'm keeping your businesses going so we can have an income when you come back, right? So that's one version of it. But with Black women, the documentation is there, and the scholarship had to be creative around that, like look at things differently. And so what we're seeing is a different effect. But we're also seeing some creativity and innovation in a world that denied them rights to Republican womanhood, right? So we think about Phyllis Wheatley, but we don't think about her as a married woman. So we tend to think about her as the young girl Phyllis Wheatley. We don't think about Phyllis Wheatley as Phyllis Wheatley Peters and how in adulthood she really did have to struggle, right? That her husband, they're struggling to find work, they're struggling to find housing. We deny that. We deny other women who have written and run businesses, some of which is documented and some of it which we've had to surmise from the records. But then we also forget about enslaved women. And that is a very special type of labor, right? Sometimes it's in domestic spaces, but your gender didn't deny what type of labor you were required to perform. And so when we look at expanding the lens of the revolution and we put Black women in it, inevitably the colors are brighter. Inevitably we've enhanced the photograph. It's something that we have neglected as a society, but when we add it in, you see the image differently. They're living a reality, they're here, no one is making this up. We're just documenting, we're going back to the documents that said that they were here. We knew they existed.
I was going to add from, the soldier's perspective, the importance of those Black women and the wives of those Black soldiers who are going to be so important in keeping those households running, keeping the families running. It's interesting going through some of the pension applications of these veterans and then their widows. And, sometimes you get ripped out pages from the family Bible, and it's got details about when they were married and when they had children, and then comparing that to when those veterans were enlisting during the war. And you see that what's 9 months before or 10 months before? Wait, I'm messing up my pregnancy math. What's 9 months before, the new baby's been born? Maybe less than 9 months. Once the couple finds out that they are pregnant, the husband enlists. He takes a bounty, an enlistment bounty that's going to hopefully keep that family afloat while he's away, because he knows that this enlistment in the military is a better opportunity financially for that family while he's away. But I mean, after he leaves, that family is still left behind. There's at least one letter from a soldier writing home, a Black soldier writing home to his wife. He's asking her to send money and supplies because, the pay in the military was sparse at times and they were supplied poorly at times. And I think it just speaks to the importance there, right? And how you have throughout the war men making decisions about whether to enlist or not, to re-enlist based on what's going on at home and how essential the children and women are in those decisions. I think the economic influences, the social implications of their enlistments.
Yeah, just to add on these great points, thinking about women in general and women of color in particular demands that we really think about how we're understanding this thing that we call the archive and how we approach it. And so, thinking about and thinking about then the relationship between both question and method. So if our question is how do we get at the experiences of women, in particular Black women, and how then do we understand our method? And so that raises all sorts of, I think, demanding questions that I think recent work reflects on in useful ways, but it can be problematic. I mean, so in terms of method, instead of Abigail Adams' papers, right? You might have to go through, I don't know, thousands of pages of probate records, which might take you an entire year, and you construct a database out of that, and then you compare a database of probate records to a database of church records. And then you begin to find these names that are attached to owners, for example. And so you begin to have to weave together these threads. And in many cases, the work is not necessarily all that imaginative, but it requires immense amounts of time, labor, and I'll say money, which thank goodness to the MHS and all the work that you do to support people who can take the time to do this kind of work. So there's this question of method, and then there are also these broader questions about kind of analytical categories. So, you know, Phyllis Wheatley, Baptist. And so to become a member of a Baptist church meant that you had to kind of proclaim to the congregation that God had touched you. And when they recognized kind of your individual relationship with God, then they brought you in. Religious membership worked differently in Anglican churches prior to that, or after that, Episcopal churches. And so you mentioned, forgive me, Noel, I think you mentioned, was it King's Chapel?
King's Chapel, yeah.
Offhand, which is not an evangelical Protestant or Protestant. It's not an evangelical church. And so one of the things that I found in my own research, kind of putting together these networks, is you find the wives of Black Freemasons who are the godparents for other people's children. Godparentage didn't really exist in Baptist churches because the nature of conversion was different in these types of churches. So you have Black communities that are becoming knit together, but you also have these key distinctions that do create these different kinds of gendered networks within Black communities, but you can only begin to find that kind of thing when you're doing this very kind of long kind of in some cases, I hate to say it, but kind of boring stuff, right? You're just kind of going through and you're like, I don't see the Black people there, but they're there. You just have to go through all of this stuff to get them. And in this case, this gives us much more about Black women.
Yeah, I'll also say with the Black Baptist churches, also the American Baptist Church, the structure mimics American society in that you're autonomous as a church. So the running joke is that when Baptists don't agree, they just split, form a new church. And so then you see the splits and who's talking to whom. And a lot of times when these churches are splitting, sometimes it's familial reasons why people separate. And sometimes it's more theological. A lot of times it was just personal, let's be honest. That's the human condition. But you see those splits, but then you see there's still interrelatedness that continues to happen. For us, 12th Baptist splits with the African Baptist Church over an issue of how to deal with abolitionism. Of course, they don't move far. They go into the building next door. Right. So there's still an interaction. There's still interrelatedness. So the institutions may change, they may grow, they may shift within the community, but the women are still talking to each other. The women are still engaging with each other. They're still a robust part of the community. It just shifts as things tend to shift because we're human beings.
I'm getting very sad because the conversation is about to come to a close. I want to make sure that we have enough time for Q&A, but I have two more questions for everyone. I think I'm going to start with you, Noel, because we are mourning the loss of Reverend Jesse Jackson. And one of the things that he said in talking about his life work was that he was not a perfect servant, but he was a public servant. And in this moment, when we are facing attacks on scholarship deemed critical race theory. We just saw what happened in Philadelphia with the removal of mentions of slavery to at the president's house in Philadelphia. How do you go about doing the work of a public servant to protect not only Black history, but also to reinforce the importance of Black memory?
Yeah. And during the course of my career, I've had the great fortune to interact with Reverend Jackson on a number of occasions. And so his passing hits me quite profoundly. he's someone who is revered. So for me to even think of myself as a public servant in the same capacity doesn't feel quite right. But I'll indulge your question. I think when I think of Reverend Jackson, one of the things that has resonated with me, the last couple of days is I think it's one of his Democratic convention speeches where he talks about the quilt. And he said his grandmother made a quilt there was a piece of cloth that wasn't big enough to clean your shoe. But when she cleaned it off and sewed it into the quilt, it became this thing of beauty. And so he started to call out different groups that, you're doing this great work, but your piece of fabric isn't big enough. You got to join with somebody else. And your piece of fabric isn't big enough. You got to join with someone else. And I think that is incredibly important in this moment. I have dedicated my career to interpreting the history of people of African descent and have done a lot of work with Black museums. But it would be a miss on my part to think that my quilt is big enough on my own. And so part of my work as a public servant is to demonstrate to people that Black history is American history. Happy centennial of Black History Month. But also that in order for this history to be preserved, in order for it to last another 200 years, we have to join together. I cannot preserve it on my own. It requires all of us to do that work. And I join with people who are dedicated to preserving Indigenous history because there's an obligation on my end to join together with them in that work. And same thing with LGBTQ and all these other women's history. All of it requires all of us to come together. And so when there's a loss to one, when we take down the panels of enslaved history, the question you should ask is whose history is next? They took down the flag at Stonewall because it was offensive. A flag is offensive. The lives that were lost at Stonewall were not. There are questions we need to ask. When we devalue one, when you devalue the life of enslaved people, you're also devaluing the life of others. So in this moment, reflecting on the loss of Reverend Jackson, I remind myself that my piece of the quilt is important, but it's not big enough on my own. And so I must join in the work with others.
Cherno, do you want to add?
I agree. Wow.
Okay, well, I think on that note, I actually don't have time to ask one more question. We should open it up to Q&A. So ask us your questions.
I now live in Charleston, South Carolina. My name is John Winthrop. I am the 11th generation from the guy that founded Boston, the first governor. And in that capacity, I have been told by my father, get out and work, do not get involved in ancestor worship, and leave Boston, Massachusetts, all of which I did. And I now have 4 sons, each of which is running their own company. So the gene pool is alive and well. Having said all that, we have had a debate at Harvard. And I want to add, by the way, although I am the oldest Winthrop, male Winthrop, I should say, the women are smarter than the men in our family, and there are 3 that are older than I am. So having said all of that, the key question that I have is at Harvard we've had a debate among what the Winthrop House should be named. Not the John Winthrop House, but they've resolved it, and I spoke to the committee. It's now called simply the Winthrop House. Here's my question. I wonder if anybody could speak to this. Have you experienced, if you care to talk about it, what kind of belligerence, anti-Black experiences any of you have had over the last 30 years? I've been in Charleston, South Carolina for the last 30 years, trying to get a more integration among the students. and among the people, and they even gave me an honorary degree for that. Enough about me. I want to hear about you.
Well, you go back 30 years, I was just a small child. Just kidding. Just kidding. I was a teenager. It's fine. Sure.
I'll try to be brief. And in the context of doing historical research, so in some ways I'm kind of disassociating. I'm not talking about kind of immediate personal experiences, but for me, doing history that involves trying to understand the histories of marginalized people is always a kind of emotional thing. It's always a confrontation with race. And so I don't know if you were thinking of your question in particularly this way, but I, in terms of historical stuff, and I would imagine it's true for everybody up here, there's always a kind of remembering, right, of racism. And yet you engage well-meaning people who would like to say, well, it wasn't so bad. and you're polite, maybe, and you're just thinking of all the things. And maybe you say something, maybe you don't. But that always is an issue. So in other words, somebody doesn't have to be kind of quote racist, right? But they're like, oh, it's okay, things are getting better, and you're just thinking about all the things.
And I'll just add to Cherno's comment. I don't know a Black historian who got into this work just because they loved history. I think there was a moment in everybody's life where it was like you asked a question in a history class, and you didn't get the answer you wanted, right? And it just niggled at you in the back of your brain. And sometimes, as you were saying, it's not that anyone is overtly racist, but it's the ignoring of the thought or the minimizing of your perspective where you're like, no, I think that there's something more here. And the Black scholars that you see today, and even the ones that our ancestors, all did the work despite that, right? I've been Black my whole life, I've been told. Came out of my mother's womb like that. I don't know a world where there hasn't been questions about my existence. I don't know a world where the validity of my family, my community, and my culture has not been up for debate, despite the lived experiences that I have. I don't know a world where the way my church worships is called into question. The way that my father, who's a minister, thinks about Christian theology is called into question, despite the fact that he can cite major theologians like James Cone. That is the world that I live in. The challenge for me in that moment is to figure out a way to tell the story in spite of that opposition. So it exists, but it's okay that it exists. We do the work anyway.
We have a question online that's asking if you can talk more about after 1790, the experience of free Black people in Massachusetts fighting for education and housing and other things like that.
Oh, goodness. The best way for me to answer that question, this is going to seem like I'm taking a pass, but come visit the Museum of African American History, Boston and Nantucket. We tell a great story there. It's a rich history. What I will highlight to you is that community cared about what was happening to them. So from Prince and Primus Hall, starting a school in their home and then moving the school around to other people's houses in Beacon Hill, and then putting the school in the basement of the meeting house till there was a school built, to Robert Roberts suing the Commonwealth of Massachusetts so his daughter Sarah did not have to walk from the North End to Beacon Hill to go to school. He lost. However, about give or take 100 years, there was a case with some lawyers from the great Howard University who brought a case to the Supreme Court. You may have heard of it, Brown v. Board of Education, who cited that case and how wrong that decision was. So there are a plethora of stories that I just, quite frankly, do not have the time or opportunity here to get into, but I would encourage you to visit us because it is robust, it is significant, and even walking through the Black Heritage Trail on Beacon Hill, you will see how dynamic this community was and how dynamic that history continues to be.
And I would add, we think about Black activism in Boston, Massachusetts in the 1790s, especially, like it's not existing in a vacuum, right? You have these Black mutual aid societies getting formed in Newport in 1780, in Providence in, I think, 89, in Philadelphia in, I think, 87, in Boston in 96. They're all talking to each other, and they're all pushing for a lot of the same causes, including education, which really ramps up as you cross into the new century. There's a lot of collaboration there. There's folks like Felix Holbrook, one of the authors of these freedom petitions in Boston in the 70s, who's one of the founders of the Providence African Union Society. And they're talking to each other, they're communicating. This is a collaborative work across the Northeast.
I think we have time for one more.
Thank you for joining us today on this beautiful Centennial Black History Month. My question has to do more so with Black women's role during the Revolution. I think when you look back at history in multiple contexts, there's always this erasure of women's labor because of patriarchal just expectations of sacrifice from women and that entitlement of their labor. I was wondering if you all could speak more about Black women during that time and that perspective, that experience in a layered way. I know someone mentioned earlier as well that there was a Black soldier who wrote back to their wife asking to send money, to send resources, while she probably was also facing her own battles. And I just would love to hear more of that dynamic and that perspective too.
You want to answer? You can answer, Kira. You just seem like you're really excited. You really want to answer that question. I'll be moderator. You answer the question.
Does anyone? I can take it if you all want.
Can't off the top of my head remember more about that letter and the case. So I'm going to turn it over to you.
I have the privilege of running a site called the Royal House and Slave Quarters, and one of the women who was enslaved by the royal family went by the name of Belinda Sutton. Now, Belinda Sutton is extremely important for a few reasons. One, in 1783, after securing her freedom and living in Boston as a free woman, she goes, actually, freedom is not enough. She had been enslaved for decades of her life, and in her freedom, she was faced with poverty. She didn't have enough wood to heat her home. She couldn't put food on her table, and she decides to petition the general court for reparations from the royal estate. Now, she wins, which is very, very interesting and surprising. But that case is extremely influential for a few different reasons. One, it's really difficult to find Black women in 18th century records. You can find them, but it takes a lot of work. That doesn't mean you shouldn't do the work. You should look in every folder, every box until your hands are tired, and then you keep going because you might not find anything the first day. But when you start to center women like Belinda Sutton or even Elizabeth Freeman, what you actually have is actually a rich history of Black women's legal activism, Black women's political activism, and how they're also shaping conversations of freedom. More importantly, we talk about Black women utilizing the courts mostly as a 19th century story, as a 20th century story. But if you actually go all the way back to Belinda Sutton, then you actually have an 18th century story. And what you do is that you see that Black women have always not only been at the forefront of these movements, but they have petitioned in order to leave a record behind of their life. And when you think of it that way, you can go back to the many petitions she had, and you find out that she was married. She has the last name Sutton. You find out that she's in Boston. You find out that she's trying to take care of her daughter who is sick. So it goes back to this history about protecting one's family and providing for one's family. And more importantly, you see that, you know, freedom is not always as rosy as we would like it to be, that there are challenges, but even with those challenges, Black women, Black men as well are petitioning in order to change society. They are actually thinking about what it takes to make a world anew. And then they're also enacting it. And so she wins 15 pounds and 12 shillings. She only receives 2 payments, but she keeps petitioning. She keeps going. And so when we think about her history, when we think about Black women, I think one of the takeaways is that we have to understand that they have always been their own political agents. And when you understand them as political agents, then you have to understand the revolutionary ideals differently in this period.
I would also say there's something about Black women's independence during this time period that's incredibly powerful. And as you were talking, the story of Ona Judge popped into my head. And that says to me, first of all, the fact that she's self-emancipated is amazing. But there's something about her value and her labor because it really angered General George Washington to the point that he keeps writing letters like, you should come back. Like, I was reading Erica Dunbar's book on Ona Judge, and I was like, no, there's no way he thought that that was really going to work, right? Like, come back and be enslaved on Mount Vernon. Nah, I'm cool. Wherever I am, it's much better than working for you. But he is really put out that he lost this Black woman. And you could say it's about property, it's about ego, but I also think it's a Black woman having the audacity to put a value on herself when society would not, and said, this is my value, and I would rather live this way than how I was living with you, right? And the fact that he keeps doing this almost to the end of his life, to me, I find hilarious because she was living rent-free in that man's head forever.
I just want to thank our panelists, Dr. Trent, Dr. Remillard, Dr. Sese, and Dr. Singleton for a really thoughtful and powerful discussion tonight on how Black people shaped America's founding and established freedom and community during the Revolution. I'd also like to extend a very special thank you to MHS trustee, Reverend Dr. Gregory Groover, for your interest and passion for telling the story. So thank you, and a round of applause for our wonderful panelists. So, I also want to thank our lovely audience tonight, both in person and the hundreds of people who are with us online tonight. Programs such as this are possible because of the support provided by friends like you, and information about upcoming programs can be found on the Society's website, www.masshis.org. I hope you join us again. We're wrapping up tonight. The building will probably close up in about 20 minutes, but thank you so very much and have a wonderful evening.